Good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's presentation of Deepfake Literacy, Creating, Using, Misusing, and Detecting Synthetic Media. I'm Rebecca Roberts. I'm the Curator of Programming at Planet Word, a museum of words and language here in Washington, D.C. That's it in my Zoom background. If you've had a chance to visit Planet Word and you're already a member, thank you so much for that support. It's the reason we're able to keep admission free to the museum, present programs like this one. If you found out about this program through other channels and you'd like to know more about Planet Word, the best way is to set up to receive our newsletter. You can do that at our website, planetwordmuseum.org, or follow us on social media. And you'll see the calendar of events we have coming up through the winter. With that, I would very much like to introduce our speaker tonight. I know for those of you who participate in a lot of Planet Word programs, we often talk about literal literacy, actually learning how to read or understand language in all of its forms. This is literacy of another but equally vital kind of being able to sort of turn a critical eye on the media around us. And I'm delighted that our guide this evening is Dr. Hani Farid. He's a professor at the University of California, Berkeley, with a joint appointment in electrical engineering and computer science and the School of Information. And when I was looking for someone to take on this topic, I read an article he published that was the most understandable and clear-eyed argument I had ever heard on the topic. So I am very much looking forward to this presentation. And with that, I will turn it over to Hani Farid. Welcome to Planet Word.
Thank you so much. I really have no place as a mathematician and computer scientist talking to people who study the English language, but I appreciate the invitation. Thank you for the chance to speak with you all. We're going to talk today about deepfakes. I actually don't like that term very much. It really should be synthetic media, but deepfakes is that word that is in the media and in the social conscience. And so I'm going to stick with that for now. It's a form of manipulating the visual record. And we're going to talk about what they are, how they're being used and misused, and what we can do to distinguish reality from fiction in the form of manipulated images and video. Let's start by acknowledging that manipulating the photographic record is absolutely not new. Go back to the 1800s, go back to the very beginnings of photography. In the 1800s, Stalin famously airbrushed people out of photos because they fell out of favor. Now, obviously, this was done in a dark room where somebody was painting over a negative and re-exposing it. And by the way, just as a side note here, I find this fascinating that people like Stalin, he was not alone. Hitler did it, and Mao did it, and all of the dictators throughout history airbrushed people out of photographs. And one of the questions you want to ask yourself is why? And I obviously don't really know, but here's a speculation, is because they understood the power of visual imagery. They understood that if you change the visual record, you change history. And they wanted these people out of history. And there's power in visual imagery. And I mention this because I think that as we go through the next 45 minutes or so of chatting, I want you to keep in mind how powerful visual imagery is and why have we historically and continue to manipulate the photographic record. Now, obviously, from the 1800s, let's fast forward 100 years or so into the digital revolution of the early 1990s, we started seeing a different form of digital manipulation. It was no longer film and darkrooms and paintings, but it was things like Photoshop, where you could take a photo and insert somebody into a photo. And what happened here was, well, a couple of things. One is we all now had digital cameras, or we're starting to have digital cameras, but we also have now started to democratize access to the tools to manipulate media. It was no longer a handful of very talented artists who can paint onto negatives and then re-expose, but it was now somebody with a laptop and Photoshop and a digital camera and some reasonable skills. And then fast forward a little bit more into the early 2000s, and the ability to manipulate photographs became even more powerful because Photoshop became more powerful. And so you started to be able to do things like this, which is not a real photo, of course. And now we're starting to get really interesting digital fakes, both in terms of images and videos, because the tools are getting more sophisticated and the cameras are getting higher resolution and higher quality. And then fast forward a little bit more. Now we're into 2017, about 5 years or so ago. And now we start to see a new brand of manipulated media, deepfakes, and that's what we're going to talk about right now. But again, I want to emphasize that everything we're going to talk about from now on is part of a continuum from the 1800s through the 1900s and through the early noughts and to today, where we have always been manipulating digital media. And what has changed, as you will see in a minute, is the ease and the democratization and the impact of those manipulations. Okay, so let's dig in. Navigate to that website, thispersondoesnotexist.com, all one word, and true to its URL, you will be presented with a face of a person who does not exist. These are 8 representative examples that I've pulled from that website. And you can see that they cross gender and race and overall appearance. And they're really good. And this is a form of a deep fake. And the first thing you want to ask about what is this thing is how is it made? Where are these things coming from? And let's start by talking about this, because this is really where the real power of deep fakes is. Here's the basic idea. You want to make an image of a person, of a face, like my face. And so what's an image? It's just a bunch of pixels. So here's an image up here. It's just a random pixels. And the generator, whose job it is to make the image of a face, starts by splatting down a bunch of random pixels. And it says, I wonder if this is a face. Okay? So it takes that image and it hands it over to a discriminator. And the discriminator's job is to say, is that a face? Now, how does it do it? Well, it has access to a bunch of, well, faces. It actually has a database of faces that have been scraped from the internet or wherever they got it from. And it says, well, I can tell the difference between that thing and those things right there, so it's not a face. And it goes back to the generator and says, nope, not a face, please try again. Generator modifies some pixels, creates a new image, sends it back to the discriminator, and in a very tight loop, this thing operates over and over and over again, millions and millions of times. And eventually it will modify enough pixels so that the image it sends over to the discriminator will be like, oh, it's a face, we're done. This is called the generative adversarial network, a GAN. Generative, because it's making something. Adversarial, because you've pitted these two systems against each other, the forger and the detective, if you will. And network, because underneath these two boxes, the underlying computational machinery is a deep neural network, which you've probably been hearing a lot about because it's what's been fueling this latest revolution in artificial intelligence and machine learning. And now you can see why these synthetic faces are so powerful, because I don't actually have to do anything. I don't need Photoshop. I don't have to know how to use Photoshop. All I have to do is train these two systems, which somebody else has done for me, create a database of a bunch of stuff that I want. These can be faces, they can be cats, they can be dogs, they can be airplanes, they can be landscapes, whatever category you want. The GAN doesn't care. And then the machines just fight against each other until the generator makes something the discriminator says, oh, I can't tell. And there's that power, because now the machine is doing the hard work of what used to be in the hands of the person in the dark room or the person at the laptop manipulating images in Photoshop. The machine is now doing all the hard work. Now, the second thing you want to ask about these images is, well, how realistic are they? I mean, I'm showing you these tiny little thumbnails, and Zoom is probably compressing these images, and maybe it's hard to see. And so you want to ask yourself, well, how good is this GAN? And so here's what we did. We generated 400 fake images spanning different apparent races and genders. And for each one of these faces, we have a matching real face. And you can see that what we've done here is we've matched it for gender and for race and for overall appearance. And I won't talk about how we do that. There's a computational trick for how we make sure we have this paired faces. And then we ask people to simply look at one of the faces and say, do you think it's real or synthetic? Is it a real person or is it a fake person? Right? Really simple task. Yeah. And here's what we found. We recruited 315 participants in an online survey. We paid them for their time. And we asked them to do this task. Half of the images they saw were real, half of the images were fake. So if you flip the coin, your chance accuracy would be 50%, which is right here where I'm pointing. This is the distribution of these 315 participants in our task. And you can see that the median response is in fact chance. There's a few people who are better than what you would expect if this was just a usual normal distribution, but this is a very difficult task. People are really struggling to tell the difference between a real person and a synthetic face. Now you could say, well, okay, fine, 315 people on the internet, they don't know anything about synthetic images, you're paying a couple bucks to do a task. Maybe the experts, people like me, somebody who specializes in computer graphics and machine learning will be able to do better. Fair enough. So what we did is we said, well, what if we train people for the types of artifacts you might expect to see in a synthetically generated image and see if we can get them to do better at the task. So we did that. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to tell you, for example, that synthetic images tend to be portrait from the neck up, and the backgrounds tend to be extremely nondescript. So you wouldn't see things like this door in my office that you see here with this very specific geometry and detail. So you see here, all of these are these very generic amorphous backgrounds, and that's because the GANs don't know how to generate things like this highly detailed. It's not trained to do it. So look out for the backgrounds. Don't just focus only on the face. Here's another thing we told them. When I look at a face, we spend about 2/3 of our time looking at a Y pattern between the eyes, the nose, and the mouth. And that's not surprising. That's where expressions are done. That's where eye contact is. But we are immediately drawn. Our brain is immediately drawn to the center part of the face. And we spend most of our time looking there at a face. And we can't really help it. It's very natural. But what we tell people is, these synthetically generated images sometimes have these weird artifacts. So this guy right here, you may not have noticed, part of it is just a small image, but this part of his shoulder right here something looks weird. The generator did something odd where the shirt is cut off. So we tell people, look around the image. Don't just focus only on the face, but look around the images, typically on the shoulders and in the hair. You may find some rendering artifacts. Here's another thing we told them. This is my favorite one. The GANs don't know anything about the bilateral symmetry of faces. Most faces are fairly symmetric down the center, the eyes, the pupils, the reflections on the eyes, the ears, etc. Here, for example, which is a magnified view of this person, you notice that the earrings are different. Not impossible, but seems a little odd. You also see it on the glasses. When you have people with glasses, the frame may be different here than it may be over here. And so we tell them to look at the bilateral symmetry and make sure that things like earrings, glasses, and jewelry are consistent. Again, another visual clue to help you get better. We ran the whole experiment all over again, a new set of 219 participants, and we trained them. So they had about 20 minutes of training where we showed them the clues. We gave them a bunch of examples of it. They ran through a bunch of trials. And then as they were doing the experiment, we gave them feedback. So every time they answered an image, we said, you got it right, you got it wrong, you got it right, you got it wrong. And over time, the idea is that you start getting better at it. So even with the training, even with the feedback, accuracy only improved to 60%, where again, chance is 50%. This is a really hard task. And that's because these GANs are generating phenomenally realistic images of people who don't exist. We have passed through the so-called uncanny valley. We now can have computer-generated faces that are so realistic that people struggle to distinguish them from reality. And in many ways, that should be celebrated for computer vision and computer graphics and machine learning. It's a phenomenal achievement, but also is potentially problematic in the ability to distort the visual record. Here's an interesting side experiment we did, by the way. We wondered if instead of asking you, do you think it's real or fake? What if we asked you some other aspect? Maybe there's something just sort of creepy about these faces. There's something that seems uncanny or unreal about them. And so we got a whole new set of participants who don't know anything about the original task. And we asked them to rate the trustworthiness of the faces on a scale of 1, very untrustworthy, to 7, very trustworthy. And what we found is that the fake faces were slightly more trustworthy, 4.78 versus 4.48. Not a huge difference, very, very small, but statistically significant. And that's really interesting. We think the reason, by the way, is that these faces, the fake faces, tend to look more like average faces. That's an artifact of the way the GAN is programmed. And average faces, we know from social science, tends to be more trustworthy because it looks like somebody we know. And so even on a trustworthy scale, these faces are slightly more trustworthy. By the way, I think it's just a matter of time before somebody figures out how to build trustworthiness into the GAN to make faces that are more trustworthy or more commanding or more respected. And then you can imagine that fake profiles based on those on dating apps or on LinkedIn or on Twitter or whatever it is will have even more power with these fake images. Now, where things get really interesting is where we go to video. So everything we've been talking about are fake images, and I'll talk a little bit about some of the uses and misuses of these images, but I want to talk first about video. So with creating a deep fake video, and you may have seen some of these, and if you haven't, I encourage you after this talk, go look up Tom Cruise TikTok. There is a young man, his name is Chris Ume, who's been creating these phenomenal deep fake videos of Tom Cruise, and they are brilliant, and they are funny, and they are exceedingly well done. And here's basically how they work. The job of the GAN is, there's my generator and my discriminator, nothing's changed, is now not to create a video of somebody saying something, but it's to change the identity of somebody in a video. So here, and I'll show you the video in a second, we're going to take Jennifer Lawrence's identity, one frame at a time in a video, and change her identity to Steve Buscemi. Why? Well, this is what the internet does, and the internet is weird, and this is just an example I found on the internet. And so now the generator's job is to start with this image, modify some pixels, send that over to the discriminator, and the discriminator's job is to say, does that look like Steve Buscemi? But I don't want just any image of Steve Buscemi. I want this to be Steve Buscemi with the same basic appearance that you have here. So you can see this new branch that says you must respect the appearance, which the head is looking down, the mouth is slightly pursed, and the eyes are looking down. But I want the identity to be Steve Buscemi. So now my database is not faces, but people of all images of Steve Buscemi, which of course is very easy to get from the internet. And so the GAN again runs in an iterative adversarial loop, changing pixels, sending it to the discriminator. Nope, not Steve Buscemi. Changing pixels, sending it to the discriminator. Nope, not Steve Buscemi, over and over and over again. And if you do this frame after frame after frame of a video, you get something that looks like this. I'm going to show you a video, and then we'll come back and we'll talk a little bit more about that.
Expected Amy to win. So I just like, it was just, this was very truly surprising for me. Yeah, I was just really surprised.
Hi, here. Sheridan Watson from BuzzFeed right here.
Hi.
So you're a huge Bravo fan.
Oh,
Who
yes.
was your favorite? And
All right, so that was Jennifer Lawrence face swapped to be Steve Buscemi. That video, by the way, is about 3 years old, and the technology has gotten much, much better since then. But you can now start to see some of the power there in our ability to distort the visual record, because now I can get people to say and do things they never did. Now, usually this is the point in the talk where I start talking about use cases and misuse cases, and then some of the defenses that we have. But I need to now interject a new type of deepfake that has emerged on the scene just over the last few months. And this is so-called paint by text, and that's particularly appropriate for this particular venue. So this is now not a GAN, but it's what's called the diffusion model, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But the way it works is you type in a caption for an image that you want. Teddy bears working on new AI research on the moon in the 1980s, and it will generate that image right there. Or a hip-hop cow in a denim jacket recording a hit single in the studio, and it will make that image. Or here's my favorite one, a medieval painting with the Wi-Fi not working, which is absolutely the best thing ever I've ever seen in a synthetic media, because that's exactly what it would look like. And now this is a very different beast in some ways, because it's not make an image of a person or a landscape or of a cat or of an airplane, but it's tell me what you want an image of, type it in, and I will synthesize it for you. And so this is a different underlying technology, and let's talk about how that works. And here's the basic idea. The training of the system, the AI system, goes like this. I give you an image with a caption, and we have hundreds of millions, billions of these that are scraped from news articles and websites and blogs and articles. So for example, you can imagine an image with the tag, teddy bears working on new AI research in the moon in the 1980s. And I give you both the text and the image. And what the AI system does is it slowly degrades the image by adding noise. You've seen the noise in before, until eventually the image is completely obliterated. But it knows that this is where it started from, and it knows that this is the text. And then what we do is we train the system to take the noise and generate and go back to the original image. Now, it may not go back to the same image, but it's going to go back to something that is semantically consistent. And there's something really brilliant about this. This is what's called the diffusion process, where I take literally hundreds of millions, close to 1 billion images with text and content. I degrade, and then I learn how to go backwards. And then type in anything you want, and it will learn how to synthesize from pure noise. So that's the one thing in common here with the GANs, which is we start with noise and we synthesize something. The underlying process and the underlying mechanism and underlying computation is different. But here you can see that paint by text is incredibly powerful, because now I'm not limited to one category, a face or a landscape or an airplane. I'm limited by my imagination. I can simply type anything I want and it will synthesize an image for me. It won't always be perfect, but it's getting better and better and better. All right, so that is the landscape from the 1800s to today on how we can manipulate the visual record, both images and video. I haven't talked about audio, by the way. All of this stuff works in audio. You can do phenomenal things today in terms of impersonating people's voices, people from President Joe Biden to Donald Trump to Jerry Seinfeld to whomever you want, to musicians to actors, and across the spectrum from audio to image and to video. We now have the ability in a very sophisticated way to alter the things that we used to trust implicitly. So what are the things that keep me up at night? What am I worried about these days? Well, I'm worried about a lot of things, but here's a short list. The very most common, sadly, application of these images and video manipulations is in the form of non-consensual sexual imagery, where people take typically a woman's likeness and they insert her into sexually explicit material and then carpet bomb the internet with that. And that could be famous performers, it could be politicians, it could be human rights activists, it could be journalists, it could be people who simply attract unwanted attention. And it is awful, and it is everywhere. There are dozens and dozens of apps, dozens and dozens of websites that will let you upload an image of anybody you want, and it will insert them into sexually explicit material, and then you can do whatever you want with that. And it is terrible, and it is impacting real people's lives. I don't think it takes a stretch of the imagination to see how this type of content can be used to fuel disinformation campaigns. We've seen this happen in the Ukraine. Somebody created a deepfake of President Zelensky saying, "We surrender," and speaking to his military, "Drop your weapons, we surrender." That video made it onto Ukrainian television and social media, of course, for a few hours before it was debunked. This is the storm that is coming because the landscape has already been set around disinformation campaigns. And now we're going to throw jet fuel on that in the form of videos and image and audio recordings of people saying and doing things that they never did. We've made it through the midterms, thank God. There's another election coming up in 2 weeks. And of course, there are elections happening all over the world. And how these start to impact political campaigns, I think, is going to start to become extremely important, particularly around the ability to tag your opponent with some really harmful content. I don't think it takes a stretch of imagination to think, how do we deal with very complex national security issues when we are trying to reason about images and video and audio recordings that are coming around the world at light speed? Huge issues for the national security audience, particularly in the for all you in the DC area. We've already started to see everything from small scale to large scale fraud, where people are creating videos of people saying and doing things that they never did, and then defrauding people of money. The latest one was in the cryptocurrency world, where somebody had created a video of the FTX guy saying, "I'm going to reimburse your money, go to this website, put in your wallet credentials," and they drained those wallets. And it was a deep fake video of the head of the cryptocurrency wallet. I don't like saying his names. I don't like him, and I don't want to give him any screen time. I've already mentioned that we've been seeing this unfold in Ukraine. And here's the thing, even though I've listed it last, I think is first. This is the thing that really keeps me up at night, is the so-called liar's dividend. This is a phrase that says, if we enter a world where any image, any video, any audio can be fake, well, then nothing has to be real. We can simply deny inconvenient facts. A video of human rights violations, Putin can say they're fake. A video of police brutality killing somebody, fake. A video of a politician saying something offensive about women, fake. If something can be fake, well, I can deny reality, and I have reasonable grounds to do that. And that is really worrisome when we enter this world where everybody can simply say, well, I don't believe it. I didn't see it with my own eyes, so I don't believe it. And I now start to wonder, how do you have a society and a democracy when we can't agree on basic facts of what's going on around the world? And that's, in some ways, despite this being a long list of problematic, nefarious uses of this technology, this is the thing that I think is going to be really interesting, and you're already seeing it. Just this week, I was dealing with a case up in Canada where a former official got caught saying some pretty offensive things on video, and is simply saying they're fake. I don't think they are, and now we're like, okay, there are people disagree. There's a disagreement here. How do we move forward and have reasonable conversations about these things? All right, so this is the type of manipulated media we're talking about, and I've talked a little bit about the nefarious uses. I haven't actually talked about the positive uses. You can ask me that in the question and answer. There, of course, are some. I'm more interested in how we protect against the nasty uses of here. So now what I want to do is, in the last part of the talk, is pivot a little bit to what are we doing to detect these types of harmful content. Okay, so I'm going to show you a video. It's a series of very, very short, about 1 to 2 seconds, of former President Obama's opening remarks in his weekly addresses when he was in the White House. Okay, so it's going to be short clip, short clip, short clip, short clip, series one after the other. And go ahead and watch it and see if you notice anything interesting, and then we'll come back and talk about it in a second.
Hi, everybody. 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 Hi, everybody.
All right, those are all different. They're all distinct. And if you noticed, when he said, hi, everybody, he did this. Hey, everybody. Hey, everybody. It's just sort of how he started. He's got this little tick, and this mannerism. And what you may not have noticed is he also did this. He said, hey, everybody. And when he came down, he pursed his lips and then was ready to go and would start his address. Consistent, almost every single weekly address, he had this little thing he did. And we all do this. I just did one, the eyebrow raise. And also, by the way, when I do that, I tend to move forward when I want to emphasize something. I also tend to raise my right eyebrow slightly more than my left eyebrow. One of the problems of doing the research I'm about to describe is, especially spending all this time on Zoom, is you really start noticing your visual tics, and it's very distracting. This also, the way we talk with our hands is quite distinct. Some of us talk more with our hands than others. Some of us talk more with our left hand than with our right hand. We have mannerisms in the way we talk, the way we shrug our shoulders, the way we lean forward, the way we furrow our brow when we emphasize a particular word. And what we have been interested in is understanding those mannerisms and modeling them so that we can distinguish real people from fake people. So it's going to go something like this. What I'm showing you here is, on this axis is time. This is about 10 seconds. And on the vertical axis, I'm showing you two things from this authentic weekly address of President Obama. In blue, what I'm showing you is his head rotation up and down as if nodding in the affirmative. So down is he's nodding down, up is he's nodding up. Okay. And in orange, what I'm showing you is how much he is smiling, that's up, and how much he is frowning, that's down. And what do you notice? What do you notice here is that they're correlated, right? So when he lifts his head, he tends to smile, and when he turns his head down, he tends to frown. It's just something he does, yeah. Now let's imagine a fake version of President Obama. So this is what's called a lip sync deepfake. So let me talk a little bit about that, because I haven't mentioned it. You've seen the face swap deepfake. This is a lip sync deepfake. And what a lip sync deepfake is, I take an original video of President Obama, and I have a new audio track, either synthesized or an impersonator, and I re-synthesize just his mouth region, just this region here, to be consistent with the new audio track, essentially putting words into his mouth. But let's think about the nature of that deepfake now. So his head was doing whatever it wanted to do in the original video, but it doesn't know about what the mouth is doing. So the mouth is now frowning, smiling, but it doesn't know what the head is doing. So I've created this chimera. And now when you look at time, and again, head rotation in blue, smiling and frowning in orange, you can see that it's a mess. We've lost the correlation. We've lost this thing that was somewhat distinct to former President Obama. So here's what we're going to do. This works great, by the way, for world leaders, because you can just find a ton of video for them online. So you go to YouTube, you download a bunch of videos. And we take each video and we break them up into these little 10-second clips. We're going to do all of our analysis on 10-second clips. And we do standard face tracking. So here, the blue box tells me how he's rotating his head in 3 space. There are these markers all along his face and mouth. And I'm going to track his face, his features. So his eyebrows, his eyes, his eye blinks, how his mouth is moving, how his jaw is moving. I track all of those things. And from those, the motion that I'm tracking of all the features, I'm going to extract 18 so-called action units. So these are things like furrowing the brow, smiling, frowning, raising the eyebrow. These are standard measures of how we are moving various parts of our face. We have 18 of them. I'm showing you some of them here, plus 2 head movements, how I rotate my head up and down and left to right. We ignore this rotation, by the way, because politicians, when they talk, they scan the audience, and this just is not a diagnostic rotation. So I have 20 measurements that I make at every moment in a 10-second video, typically at 30 frames a second. So there's about 300 frames. For every one of those, I make 20 measurements. And then what I'm going to ask is, how are those measurements correlated? In the same way that I showed you earlier with the head rotation and the smiling and the frowning. And I'm going to try to discover what are the characteristics that distinguish me from President Obama, from President Biden, and whomever. Yep. Okay, so I wish I could show you what this looks like in the original 190 dimensional space, but I can't visualize 190 dimension. It makes me crazy, but I can visualize 2 dimensions. So I'm going to take these 190 measurements for a whole bunch of different people, Kamala Harris, Hillary Clinton, Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm going to project them down into this 2-dimensional space using a very clever computational trick. Everything here is color-coded. So this means that all of these dots here that are orange are from Obama 10-second clips. These are from Kamala Harris, Hillary Clinton, Elizabeth Warren, so on and so forth. And what do you notice? You notice 2 things. One is all the Obama points are clustered, and they're distinct from Cory Booker and Donald Trump and Joe Biden and Pete Buttigieg and so on and so forth. And what you also notice is that down here in the brown are all the different types of deep fake Obamas. These are deep fakes that we made. These are deep fakes that are in the wild. These are deep fakes that we've commissioned. And now we have an ability to distinguish Obama from deep fake Obama. Well, we actually have an ability to distinguish Obama from, well, everybody. So what's cool about this idea is I'm not really building fundamentally a deep fake detector. What I'm building is an Obama detector. Is the person talking moving the way President Obama moves? So if it's not, well, maybe it's a deep fake, or maybe it's just a different person. I don't care. This is essentially a biometric question. And what's really neat about this is that as new deep fakes emerge onto the scene, we don't care about them. I mean, they're not Obama. It's all we care about, that you're not capturing these really interesting characteristics about how an individual speaks. Now, before I show you the efficacy of this, let me mention that we've extended this work a little bit, and I'm going to tell you how we extended it. And we've been particularly interested in using this to protect President Zelensky of the Ukraine against deepfakes, because we've seen the deepfakes being created. We think there are probably more to come. And so what we did is we took that basic work that I just described to you, looking at the the facial expression. So that was the eye movements, the eyebrows, the smiling, the frowning, and the head rotations. Those are those measurements I just told you about. And we're going to augment that with something that I mentioned earlier, which is hand gestures. So particularly for President Zelensky, he tends to talk a lot with his hands. This is true whether he's at the podium or when he's at his desk. So now, in addition to tracking head and facial expressions, we're also going to track upper body. And that's what you see here annotated across these 5 frames. We're going to track how he's moving his arms and then look at those motions. And then the last thing we're going to add to that is the vocal patterns. So this is what's called the spectrogram of how he's talking. And what's really interesting about voice is a couple of things. First of all, my voice sounds different than Rebecca's voice that you heard earlier. That sounds different than somebody else's voice. So just the voice biometric is quite distinct. But also, I have a microphone in front of me here. Let me lift it up so you can see this. And so I'm talking now. And when I turn my head, maybe to look at somebody over there, it's going to sound a little bit different, because the distance between and the direction I'm facing here and here and here is going to be different. So there's going to be a correlation between my head movements and my audio. Also, when I raise my hand, my diaphragm changes a little bit. So there's a different intonation in my voice as well. And so we're going to look not just at the expressions on the face and the upper body, but also the vocal patterns and all of the correlations between them to make this model much, much more dynamic and capturing many aspects of how a person talks. And so now what we're going to do is the same game. We're going to go out and collect a bunch of videos of President Zelensky. Super easy to do. He's got them all on his website. These are pre-war when he was wearing a suit and giving press conferences. This is now after the war. You can see him in the fatigues. This is at the press conference. This is in his bunker, and this is at his desk. By the way, you can see in each one of these, he's talking with his hands. We, again, learn the mannerisms specific to President Zelensky. And then what we ask is, well, how well can we detect deep fakes? And here what we did is we went out and commissioned a company that creates deep fakes of President Zelensky. We didn't have him say anything crazy. We didn't release the deep fakes to the public, but we wanted to create really high-end deep fakes. And what I'm going to show you is the accuracy with which you can do that, but it's a little muddied up in this graph. So let me tease out a few things here. First, there's 3 graphs here. We can just pay attention to the blue one. The blue one corresponds to there's 2 types of mistakes you make in the classification. One mistake is there's a deep fake and you say it's real. And then the other is there's a real and you say it's a deep fake. We want to minimize the latter and maximize the former. So what we want to say here is in the blue, this is that only 1 in 1,000 times do we say that something that is actually real is fake. So that's why it's called, that's 99%. 99.9%, we get the real right. That's good. We're going to fix that. Yep. And now the question is, how many of the fakes do you catch? So I'm going to make a mistake 1 out of 1,000 times saying that a real is fake. And now the question is, how many of the fakes do you catch? You want that to be 100%. The horizontal axis here is how many features went into the model. So remember I said we have the facial models, the gestural models, the hands, and then the vocal models. Total model is 800 features. But we were curious, how many of those do you really need? So we do what's called an ablation study. And we said, well, what if we only had 10 features? And so we pick a random subset of 10 and we train the classifier and we see how well it does. And we do that over and over and over again. And we're terrible. With 10 features, you're catching almost none of the fakes. 25 features, terrible. 50 features, terrible. 100 features, you're only catching 20% of the fakes. That's not great. 200 features, okay. Now we're starting to get a little bit better. We're at about, let's call that 70% of the fakes. Still, 30% of the fakes are breaking through. 400 features, so half of the actual size of the model. Now you're at 99%, 99.5, and now we're at 100%. So when you have the full model, every single fake, which by the way is now broken up into 10-second segments, only that's all we're looking at, we can catch every single fake consistently across hundreds and hundreds of these examples and across 8 hours of authentic video. So we have a highly discriminative model trained, but only for one person. And there's the rub here. Now, where I think, and somebody should ask me in the Q&A how we're going to generalize this and how people can attack this. It's a really interesting question. Now, where things are going to get even more interesting, and I just want to mention this before I wrap up and we can open it up for questions, is not only can we create deep fakes and post them onto YouTube and TikTok and Twitter, but now we can create live deep fakes. And in fact, just over the last few months, individually, the mayors of Berlin, Madrid, and Vienna each spent 15 to 20 minutes talking to a deep fake version of the mayor of Kyiv before they realized it wasn't the mayor of Kyiv, it was a deep fake impersonator. And that was being done live on a Zoom call, just like this one. And here's the question you want to ask yourself at this point. How do you know this is me? How do you know this isn't my grad student and Professor Fareed was too lazy to come give this talk? So we had this grad student mimicking him. It is me. But this is now going to get really interesting. So not only can we not believe the images and the video and the audios that you see online, what if you can't trust the very live video calls that we've all spent the last 2.5 years of our lives on? Now that's going to get very interesting. All right. This is the team that worked on all this project. So let me just talk about them for a little bit. Sophie Nightingale, now Professor Nightingale at the University of Lancaster, was a postdoc in my lab a few years ago, and she did all those perceptual studies on distinguishing real people from fake people, and when she was in my lab. Shruti Agarwal, now Dr. Agarwal, is a postdoctoral fellow at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology up in Cambridge. She did all the early deepfake detection, all that Obama stuff that I showed you for the facial expressions. And this young man, Maciej Bohatczyk, who's in the Czech Republic, and believe it or not, is actually a high school student and a truly remarkable young man, picked up where Shruti left off and extended that to the gestural and voice, and did all the work on the President Zelensky models. And these are the brains and the machinery behind everything that got done in the lab over the last few years for detecting these types of deep fakes. I hope I've given you sort of a flavor for the history of photo manipulation and video manipulation. I hope I've given you a flavor for why I think we should be a little worried about this, and maybe a little hope on how we might be able to deal with this. I think it's a really interesting and very complex space, but one that I think we have to start taking very seriously, because if the visual record gets so polluted that we can no longer believe what we see, hear, or read online, I think we as a society and a democracy are in a lot of trouble. And I'm looking forward to everybody's questions now, and I'll turn it back over to Rebecca to take over. Thank you, Rebecca.
Thank you so much. And as people are adding questions to the Q&A box, I wanted to ask a quick clarifying question. So you talked about commissioning these deepfake videos. Who do you commission them from? Why do those groups exist?
Good. There's a handful of companies that are in the business of making deepfakes, not necessarily nefarious deepfakes. They're making deepfakes for commercial purposes. So what are the most common commercial purposes? One of them is Hollywood, right? Hollywood loves this technology because you can make look people younger or older, or you can insert whoever you want into a movie. By the way, I have a prediction that in the next decade, I'm going to be able to go over to Netflix and not only queue up a movie, but say, I want to see Brad Pitt in the leading role, not whoever was cast. Why not? Why can't I do that? Here's another really cool application, which is you were talking about closed captioning. What if somebody wanted to hear this in Italian or Spanish or French? You can create a deep fake version of me where it takes the closed captioning, synthesizes speech in French, and then resynthesizes my mouth to be consistent with that. And you can do that in real time. That's a really cool application. People are using it for more mundane things like creating training videos for companies so they don't have to go out and hire actors and build studios and translate to any number of languages. So there's lots of interesting use cases. But of course, that same technology can be misused in really complex and, if I can say it, interesting ways.
Yeah. Well, it does sort of seem that some of these things have been imagined by Hollywood first, right? I think
all of this technology comes to understand, first of all, we've been manipulating digital media for Hollywood for as long as Hollywood has been around. And all of this technology comes from that same basic community, right? The ability to in very creative and interesting and exciting ways, change the visual record for purposes of entertainment. And that's fine. But of course, what's happened is that the technology that used to be in the hands of the Hollywood studio is now in the hands of many. And now you're starting to see the misuses case because it's all AI powered, and it's AI powered on something like a laptop. You don't even need a lot of computing power.
Yeah, the barrier to entry is so low.
Mm-hmm.
I think of those early Mission Impossible movies where put a little device on their throats and change their voices. And we do have a question in the Q&A saying, I'm interested about audio deepfake for speech.
Good.
Are we at a stage where voices can be converted in real time to a target voice?
Good, great question. And the answer is yes, but it depends on your definition of real time. So first of all, offline, absolutely. You can take that GAN structure that I showed you at the beginning of the talk, train it on a bunch of voices of Jerry Seinfeld, Joe Rogan, whoever you want. And then you do what's called text to speech. You type and it synthesizes for you, right? That's an offline process. But there are now commercial products that you can download and use that will change it with about a half a second delay. And they come with pre-trained models, President Obama, President Biden, a handful of Morgan Freeman, people with very noticeable voices. I don't know how they're getting around the copyright, by the way. There's a really interesting legal question here about the copyright and right to publicity that I don't understand. But it's about a half a second delay, and it's being done in real time, and it is very, very good. And the full version of the model is you can then take anybody's voice you want. So you can go onto YouTube, find a bunch of talks I've given publicly, take all that audio, shove it into the system, and you can create a virtual version of me. So yes, real time voice morphing, if you will, or speaking in somebody else's voices is here.
Julie F asks, what's the ratio of researchers working to refine the technology versus those working to teach the general population about them?
Oh man, it's almost like I planted that question. Give me your address and I'll send her $20. Thanks for that question. It's a great question. And this is what's really interesting is I don't actually know the real ratio, but if I had to guess, it's 100 to 1, where the 100 are making the stuff and the 1 is detecting it. And there's no fundamental reason for that other than the communities historically that are behind the synthesis are computer graphics, computer vision, and machine learning. And those are phenomenally large historically communities. They have always been very large. My community, which is in the forensic side, I mean, the field is only 20 years old. I mean, really 10 years old, if you think about really in terms of these deep types of deepfake threats. And it's a small community, and it takes a long time to build the community because I've got to train a grad student one at a time who then has to get a faculty position and then start doing research and training their grad students. And so the lead time on building out the academic infrastructure is very, very slow. I don't know if it's 100 to 1, but it's probably something like that. If you go look at the size of the conferences that I go to, 100 people. You go to a big computer vision conference, 10,000 people. It's amazing. And it's not that all those people are trying to do bad things. Don't get me wrong. I mean, they're just doing cool things that they think is cool. And I think they may not be thinking through the whole process of what happens when I put this online and people take it and create non-consensual sexual imagery. I'd like for them to think about that. I'd like for people to think about the implications of the technology they develop and not just do things because you can, but maybe ask if you should. But yeah, we're sort of outgunned.
Yeah, it feels like a constant in the digital revolution though, right? That the technology is neutral crowd is not necessarily thinking through.
I got to tell you, I'm so tired of people telling me that technology is neutral. If we have learned anything over the last 20 years, that it is not neutral. It is not inherently good. It's not inherently bad either, but it's certainly not inherently good or neutral. And here's the analogy I like to draw is if I'm a biologist and I figure out how to create a deadly airborne virus out of the ingredients in my kitchen, is there anybody on this call that thinks it would be reasonable for me to publish that recipe online and then sit back and be like, well, let's see what happens next? Nobody would think that's reasonable, that kind of physical threat to the world. But somehow when it comes to pixels and bytes and bits, people are like, it's the internet, who cares? But that's not true anymore. We've got to get out of our head this idea that there's an online world and an offline world. And the online world is like Las Vegas. What happens on the internet stays on the internet. It doesn't. There is no more online and offline world. There's the world. And it's all intermixed. And very much what happens in the online world affects us in the offline world. And I think we have to start thinking about the development and deployment of technology in the same way that we think about physical harms from the science that we do in the chemistry department across campus, in the physics department, in the biology department, and think about technology in the same way we think about products. Products are safety tested to oblivion these days so they don't blow up in your hands. That's good. That's a good thing. There should be barriers. But I don't think we have that in the technology world because it's a young field, it's immature, it's dominated by a very particular type of people who are drawn to this field. This is also a problem with the lack of diversity in our field. And I think we can do better.
Liz LeBron asks, is the goal to produce and sell individual detection models to people like politicians and celebrities who have a vested interest in protecting themselves?
Yeah. First of all, I don't have a business model. I'm a professor, so that's not really my business model. But I think what we have been focusing on is in particular world leaders. And that's because I don't think this will be a controversial thing to say is, when the president of the United States or of Ukraine or of Russia or China or any other country for that matter, gets up and says something, the stakes are high. That's a big impact. And that's not to say that I'm not worried about how non-consensual sexual imagery is affecting individuals. I am. I'm starting from what I think are probably some of the most serious problems where a video of Putin saying I've launched nuclear weapons against the United States and we're off to global nuclear meltdown. I want to make sure that, we have the tools available to reason about a very complex and fast moving world. So that's what we're focused on. There is a really interesting question here is what do you do with these tools? And we struggle with this a great deal. We don't think we are going to make them publicly available, because the thing we fear is that the bad guys take our President Zelensky tool and then just uses it to keep testing their system and making better and better deepfakes. We don't want that. So right now, the thinking, and I have to say this is something that we are constantly rethinking and refining, is that we make this available to mainstream media outlets. Even just, by the way, saying mainstream media outlets is complicated. And to trusted government agencies that want to try to reason about videos that are being released of world leaders. I don't have great answers. There are edge cases. What do you do with certain governments that are, maybe not as trustworthy as other? I don't know. And it's something that we'll start to explore as we get there. But I will tell you that, we do talk with some of the folks in Rebecca's neck of the woods in DC. We do talk with reporters at places like the Associated Press and Reuters and the New York Times. And we will slowly build that out as need be.
Well, this brings up the issue of scale, which you referenced, that, as you say, you're not building a fake detector, you built an Obama detector.
Yeah.
So start with the people who, if there is a fake of them, will have the biggest impact, right? But it's a one-off every time.
Yeah, it is a one-off. So that's the bad news. The good news is we're getting better at this. So Matthias, who I mentioned at the end of the talk, what he'll tell you is training the first model took a year. Training the second model will take a month. Training the third one will take a week, and then it'll go down to a day. Like, we're going to get better at it. We're starting to streamline the process. And, it's not, I won't be able to protect 8 billion people, but we'll be able to scale up into the hundreds, probably pretty easily, hundreds of world leaders, maybe some CEOs where, you don't want somebody, by the way, I don't know if you saw this, by the way, but somebody created a fake Twitter account because Elon Musk is a dope and created these $8 a month authentications, and tweeted out looking like it was from a pharmaceutical company that we're going to make insulin free. Billions of dollars in stock value plummeted. What happens now if it's a video of the CEO of a pharmaceutical company or a bank or whatever it is saying, our profits are down by 20%. How long does it take you to move the market billions of dollars? Yeah, the stakes are high. So maybe CEOs are next. People whose very words, the chairman of the Fed can move markets to the tune of billions. And we'll start working our way down that list. But it's a pretty long list. And the threats, it's a moving landscape, right? So as we're doing this, the fakes are getting better, the democratization is getting more, and understand something too, by the way, that the threat here is not just fundamentally about the deep fakes, but it's that I now have a delivery mechanism through social media to deliver it to the world instantaneously through Twitter and YouTube and TikTok and Facebook. And so that's, in some ways we shouldn't ignore the fact that it's not just that I can create this, but that I can distribute it to the world. Because why? I've democratized access to publishing, right? Which has been a boom in many ways, but also has been problematic in many ways that we have seen around disinformation and around hate and around all kinds of nonsense that is the internet today. And so there's a double edge there that we have to deal with.
And you get it further and further from its source and make it harder to pin down at the beginning. Yeah. There's a clarifying question from Julie F. In that graphic where you had the political candidates and their gestures clustered into colored blobs.
Yeah.
There was some space between that was light blue that you labeled FF, and she's wondering, what did FF stand for?
Oh, that's so good. Can I just say, I love that somebody noticed that. That is awesome. As a professor, I'm always so happy when people notice these things I brushed under the rugs. Yes, I brushed under the rug all these light blue, which is FF. FF stands for Face Forensics. It's a database that we use for testing, and it's primarily newscasters. So every one of these blue dots is somebody different. And I just don't have a version of the graph without them in there, which is why I showed them. And that's why they're not clustered. They actually are all different individuals.
Fascinating. And good catch.
Thanks for that.
Too. Liz LeBron asks, how did you choose study participants? Were you looking for particular demographic and social traits?
Good question. So in the first study where we recruited participants to look at images of faces, we went on to what's called Mechanical Turk. This is a service offered by Amazon where you can pay people to do tasks. They can be tasks like transcribe this audio, or in our case, they're tasked like a perceptual task. We do not have control. We did not control, I should say, for demographics. So these are all US based. You can do this globally. These are US based. I can tell you that we do ask people to self-report gender, race, age, and education level. And we did not find any correlation with performance against any of those demographics. But it's not particularly evenly distributed. Mechanical Turk workers tend to be predominantly white, predominantly men, and predominantly young, youngish, I should say. They all have to be over the age of 18. So it's not a particularly good random sampling that you might want, for example, if you're doing a poll about the next election. But we have, not in this study, but in previous studies, what we have done is very careful in-lab perceptual studies where we control for everything. And then we compare those results to what we get from Mechanical Turk. And we find that, in fact, even though it's not particularly representative across the demographic and gender groups, it actually, the results hold up quite well.
I think we have time for one more question. I think this is a good one to end on. Sarah Wagner asks, how do you stay so seemingly positive about this issue? Do you see progress in detection? I feel like this is akin to hacking, where the hackers are regularly ahead of those trying to stop them.
First of all, there's bourbon in here, which is how I stay. God, that's a great question. I think here's the short answer. I don't know what else to do. I mean, because the other alternative is to crawl into a fetal position and hide under your bed. I do think it, you know, particularly coming off of COVID, it is hard to remain positive. There are some truly awful things happening on the internet on a daily basis, to individuals, to groups, to societies and democracies. And it is deeply, deeply troubling that a small number of CEOs have no problem torching society to become even slightly wealthier than they already are, obscenely wealthy. And that, I find that troubling. I want to believe as a technologist, I don't believe that technology is neutral and inherently good, but I believe in the power of technology. And I have to believe that the mess that a bunch of technologists got into, a bunch of technologists and other smart people can get us out of. I do think, though, that the solutions are multidimensional. I don't think it's just a technology problem. I think we need regulatory relief. I think we need people to be fed up and stop using social media and say, enough. I don't want to be part of this. I think we need the media to do better. I think we need our corporate leaders to do better. And I think a collective enough is enough. It's been 20 years. This is not the internet we wanted. Let's try to do better is the only thing we can do. Otherwise, you know, I'm stockpiling food and water and moving back to Vermont. I don't know what else to do.
Well, Honey Fareed, thank you so much. This has been an absolutely fascinating hour. I really appreciate you taking the time to walk us through all these issues.
It was great to talk with you, Rebecca.
And thank you all, audience, for being part of Planet Word's Orbit, Bad Planet Joke. I hope I'll see you at another program, either in person or virtually soon. Thank you all. Good night.